Today, I'd like to talk about 5 tips for selecting officers in your nonprofit. All of this for an aligned, skilled, and fully engaged board of directors. Before we get going with the 5 tips, let's first define what is an officer. I will refer to a usual board composition here to illustrate the difference between directors and officers. In most nonprofit boards, you will have directors who are people elected by usually elected by the organization's members who sits on the board of directors. So these people, these directors, usually, depending on your governance model, of course, is a person elected by the members, usually at your annual general meeting, and these people are elected to sit on the board. The officers are people responsible for day-to-day operations. These people will have a more involved presence in some of the operations. Normally appointed by the board of directors, the officers report to the board. The officer on a nonprofit must have a demonstrated ability to perform the required work. I'm giving you a few examples here. The board chair, the treasurer, the governance secretary, even the executive director. Let's remember that most nonprofit laws in the country, whether Ontario or the federal law for that matter, indicates that the executive director is an officer on the board, usually without voting privileges at the board. Still, in the eyes of most nonprofit laws, the executive director is an officer on the board. What we will talk about today, therefore, is how to choose these officers. We're not going to go into recruiting the executive director. That's the purview of the board to hire, fire, and compensate this person based on organizational needs and organizational performance and strategic objectives. We will be talking today about naming the officers, choosing the right officers for your board, namely the chair, the treasurer, the governance secretary, and any other vice chairs that you might have on your board, depending on your functioning and your structure. So the first tip, clarifying roles before choosing the people for the roles. I invite you as a board to clearly define the responsibilities that are attached to each officer role. This is usually best documented in your governance policies and procedures. This will allow you to avoid gray areas. Every officer, in order to maximize efficiency and the board's performance, every officer must know exactly where their role begins and ends. Clarifying roles from the start helps make decisions easier, and it also strengthens accountability on the board. There is nothing more annoying sometimes when an officer, let's say the chair, for example, of the board, starts doing things that are in the responsibilities of the executive director, for example, or a vice chair trying to be the treasurer or trying to impede on the treasurer's responsibilities, especially if they're not sitting on the same committee, the finance committee. Just be careful. Just be careful. And the best way to avoid this confusion between responsibilities and roles is to document them and make sure that everyone around your board table knows these roles and these responsibilities and is able to hold each other accountable on these roles and responsibilities as well. So another tip for choosing your officers in your board is identifying the right skills and expertise. By mapping out the strengths already present around the table, for example, the governance tool that is most useful for this is a board competence matrix. Identify what's missing. So by mapping out the current board's strengths and expertises around the table, you will be able to identify what's missing. Are we missing finance expertise around the table? Are we missing governance expertise around the table? Are we lacking community knowledge, so sector-specific knowledge, public relations expertise? Remember that a balanced team helps make decisions that are solid and aligned with your nonprofit's reality. So identifying the right skills and expertise for your board when naming your officers or choosing your officers is another tip for a strong and aligned board. Seeking complementarity and diversity. When you're choosing or naming your officers, varying the profiles is important. And we're talking about a lot of different aspects here: age, gender, experience, whether it be professional or personal experience, cultural background, and include guidelines related to recruitment in governance policies and procedures. Remember that diversity brings different perspectives and helps avoid blind spots in decision making. A diverse team is much better positioned to grasp the complex and varied realities of stakeholders, from clients and service users to partners and other community members. So remember that by seeking complementarity and diversity, not just at the board level, also at the officer level, will help your board have a varied profile of individuals, will help bring different perspectives, and will help you better grasp the complex and varied realities of all of your stakeholders. Prioritizing commitment and availability. So when choosing your officers or naming your officers, make sure that they have the interest, the time, and the energy that is required for the role. What I'm encouraging you to do here is to avoid symbolic or inactive officer roles that weaken board cohesion. Remember that truly engaged officers enhance both the board's credibility and its effectiveness. Rather than choosing someone for their reputation or because they've been the chair for the 5 past years, let's start thinking about what is best for the board. For example, if you've had a chair in the last 2-3 years that has missed maybe a quarter to a half of the board meetings, I think there's room here for reflection at the board table and saying, does this person really have the time and energy that's required? And this person may not have bad intentions. They probably want to serve on the board just like their colleagues. They just might not have the required time to do so. All of these factors should be considered at the board level when choosing or naming your officers. And last but not least, appoint transparently as opposed to behind closed doors. Share the officer appointment process clearly with the whole board. Documenting them in your governance policies and procedures is always a good way to go. Explain why and how each person is chosen or proposed either by governance committee or some other way, depending on your board functioning and your policies. This might look a bit different, but explaining the why and the how usually goes a long way towards building transparency, trust, and preventing long-term frustrations or misunderstandings at the board level when it comes to appointing and naming officers. Now, time for pitfalls, risks, tips, and impacts. Appointing only newly elected directors as officers. The pitfall here is that choosing officers solely from among newly elected directors can have a negative impact on the organization. Assigning key roles to people who lack knowledge of the organization's culture and internal workings may have negative impacts. The tip here is prioritize appointing officers from among existing directors, those people who already have a solid understanding of the organization, its realities, and strategic objectives. There might be exceptions here, but in general, try to select your officers among directors who have been there at the board level for some time. This will help you ensure stable, effective governance where officers are ready to act confidently and consistently from day one. choosing out of habit instead of skills. The pitfall here that I have for you is appointing officers based on availability or familiarity without checking for the required skills. For example, you might have a board chair that is available, has the time, is familiar with the organization, but does not have the required skills, for example, to properly provide oversight to the executive director's role. There's a lack of required skills here for the job of the chair. A chair is not just a model of team cohesion on the board. They chair meetings. They also chair the oversight, evaluation, and compensation committee of the executive director. So the risk here, if you appoint officers based on availability or familiarity without checking for the required skills, your board might end up lacking expertise in key areas, for example, such as finance or governance. This holds true for appointing the treasurer. Oh, this person, they really know the organization well. They're not really well versed in financial terms, but they're there, they're available, they have the time, and they know the organization. So let's name them treasurer. There's a risk there. So I invite you to create a skills profile to map what's already covered and what's missing on your board against your competency matrix. Board competency matrix will help you along the road to aiming for balance between technical skills and availability at the board level. The impact here is building a board that operates strategically, credibly, and in line with its mission. I hope that if you are soon going to be in charge of or participate in an officer naming or choosing exercise, that some of what we've talked about today will help you guide you along your way. I hope some of this has been useful for you.